Welcome to Rogue Teacher, a podcast dedicated to the human narrative and how the study of history can improve the current and future state of education. Welcome to episode 3, Blues, Bees, Trees, and the Way. So the next couple episodes, we're going to take a deep dive into the Axial Age. So we're thinking roughly 800 BC to 200 BC, where you see the emergence of the classical philosophers. So you get Lao Tzu, Confucius, the Buddha, you get Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, Zoroaster in Persia. So we're going to take a look at those and how studying the classics can actually help improve your way of living today and is beneficial to students, to parents, to anybody really in society. These are 2,000-year-old lessons that I think that are more prevalent around us than we realize. And it's a matter of being aware of them and tapping into them. It'll help improve how we go about things. And by the way, the rooster is back. I don't know if you can hear the rooster, but he's up and at him. Calvin, have we named the rooster yet? Still no name for this rooster. So if you can hear the rooster, I don't want to apologize for it because he is just what he is. And so we'll start a campaign here on what to name the rooster. So if you have any ideas, let us know. He's kind of become our mascot. So we'll start today's episode in Seattle in a jazz and blues club. So I'm in college and I take a little road trip to Seattle to listen to this blues band that's from Mississippi. These old guys that are in their 60s, early 70s, traditional 12-bar blues. And I'm traveling with a good friend of mine who happens to be a percussionist. And he really knows his music. Kind of guy, if you're sitting next to him, he knows when the music's going to drop, like he already knows what's coming. So he's fun to watch music with. He gives you all kinds of insight on what you're listening to. So we're listening to this old blues band play, and it's fantastic. And we're at the table that's right off the stage. And so you can reach out and touch the bass guitarist, for example, this old guy. And they take a break, and the bass guitar sits on the edge of the stage and strikes up a conversation with my friend and I. And he's sitting there smoking a cigarette. And that's how old I am, is that there was still public smoking at one point in my life. But so he's sitting there smoking a cigarette. And my friend says, "Man, you're all about the 12-bar blues." And this guy takes a drag off his cigarette. He kind of looks at my friend for a few seconds and a little uncomfortable. And he says, "Well, what else is there, man?" And I'm going to come back to that conversation in episode 4 because it's really important, because I don't remember anything after that point because they both laughed. The conversation stopped. "What else is there, man?" They both kind of chuckle with this understanding that went over my head. I'm not a musician, and so life goes on. And I fell in love with the blues. I've always liked the blues. And I go on to China. And so I take this love of blues music with me. And so I get to China and I'm tasked with teaching American history. Nothing can be more boring for a Chinese kid than a 200 plus year history of a country versus, say, a 2,000-year-old history with theirs. And so American history can get really tedious because we don't have a lot of it. And so then we focus on very small things, like you can cover 20, 30 Supreme Court cases in a U.S. history class, for example. And so it gets very, very detailed. And so the kids are bored. And I go to my boss, a good mentor of mine, John, and he says, "Well, why don't you switch it up? Why don't you play some music?" That's a great idea. So I wound up teaching a class of a U.S. history class by teaching kids a history of American music. If you want a quick homework assignment, if you could only pick, like, let's say 30 songs from American history, however you want to define that you're going to use to teach kids both American history and English, what would you pick? It's an incredibly difficult exercise. You have Louis Armstrong, you have Bob Dylan, you have contemporary artists. Who do you leave in? Who do you leave out? I mean, I love me some Stevie Ray Vaughan, but that's a lot of guitar. So it's not really helping a kid learn English per se. And so Probably one of the hardest exercises I ever had to do as a teacher was choose the music for that class. But when you teach kids that have never really listened to the music, something magical happens. They didn't show up with a bias. And so I could play blues, and to them, that song may have come out yesterday, and so they had this, it wasn't, this is grandpa music. This is old music. Why are we listening to this? There's no bias. There's, what is this? And then I had this unit on rock and roll, and they hated it. And that caught me off guard because I'm kind of a classic rocker. I'm like, how do you not like Led Zeppelin? How do you not like Metallica? How do you not like these things? By the way, one of the best assignments I've ever seen, Alex, if you're still, I know you're listening, kid took a project on the American identity and took all of the major Metallica albums to explain U.S. history. Still one of the greatest assignments I've ever seen a kid do. Alex, good work. So I know you're listening. But so here I am in China, and the kids don't like rock and roll. So I asked this kid one day after class, Zhong, and I was like, why is it that you guys don't like rock and roll? He had a fantastic answer. I hope that he goes on to write a PhD thesis about this. He said, well, we don't like the rock and roll because there's not harmony to it. It's discombobulated. It's loud in parts. It makes abrupt changes. And we really appreciate harmony. And what was fascinating about it is that the Chinese students I taught loved blues music, and in particular 12-bar blues. It's highly rhythmic, right? And as humans, we love rhythm. You have a heartbeat. Teachers repeat things so that it sinks in. You repeat terms of endearment to the people you love as reassurance. If you're a parent, you repeat lessons to your kids. The music we listen to is rhythmic. Human beings naturally love a harmony to the world. And while I was living in China, and so that's what blues music does. And so while I was living in China, I became strongly interested in Eastern thought, so Eastern belief systems. And if we go back to episode 1, I asked, the homework was, what does it mean to be human? So if you said to be human is to believe, and it is this capacity that is at the root of the human prospect, that'd be a great answer. And so let's take a look at what the major belief systems are in the East, because I think they're highly instructive, again, on how we can approach day-to-day life here. So I started studying this stuff. So in the first place we want to start today is probably with like Lao Tzu. And so you've probably heard of the Tao Te Ching. If you've been in a bookstore, you've seen like the Tao of Pooh, and like Winnie the Pooh. And so the Tao Te Ching is everywhere, and people have taken it and, rewritten it to whatever means they want. And so the first book I'm taking a look at, some of you asked to, be a little more clear with like the books I'm going into. So sure, you bet. We'll take a picture of all the books that we talk about here on Rogue Teacher at the end of each podcast so you can see if you're just looking to build a reading list. So this is from The Path, What Chinese Philosophers Can Teach Us About the Good Life by Michael Puett and Christine Gross-Low out of Harvard. And so looking at, give me a minute to open up here. So taking a look at like the era of Lao Tzu. And so you've heard of the Tao Te Ching where Lao Tzu talks about the way. And so the way is sort of how the universe is governed, right? And so how it operates. And what's interesting about this is Lao Tzu goes out of his way to tell you that you can't actually articulate what the way is. In the same way that Christians might say you can't fully explain what God is, right? There's no words that can fully capture the power of God. So both Eastern and Western belief systems have that in common, which is really fascinating. And so let's dive in here a little bit. So let's talk about the way and how to experience and live in the world. And so Puett says, we already know how it feels to experience the world fully and spontaneously. It happens when we experience flow, the state in which we become so immersed in an activity that we lose ourselves in the joy of what we are doing, whether we are playing soccer, painting a picture, or reading a book. And he goes on to talk about not only Lao Tzu, but he also talks about another philosopher named Zheng Tzu. And you've all seen the yin and the yang symbol. It's everywhere when you really slow down and look at it. It's popular in art. You see it on necklaces. You see it on shirts. And so Zhengzi was one of the major philosophers behind this in what's called Taoism. So Lao Tzu, Zhengzi, they write about the Tao Te Ching, Taoism, which is a term that's coined later down the road. But stick with me here. Zhengzi referred to the terms yin and yang, or darkness and light, softness and hardness, weakness and strength. The way, he argued, is a process of constant interactions between these two elements that seem to stand in opposition but actually complement each other. They must revolve constantly to balance each other. In the winter, yin, the cold and dark element, prevails. Then things change. In summer, the season of yang, of heat and light, arrives. The constant and inevitable interplay of the energy of yin and yang does not just create seasonal change, but also characterizes all the transformations we see throughout the cosmos. A little bit more if I can. There's just one exception, Zhengzi argued, to the teeming, transforming world. Just one thing in the entire cosmos that does not spontaneously follow the way. That thing is us, human beings. We alone do not spontaneously follow the way. In fact, we actually spend our entire lives battling against the way. It's a lot to chew on. Perhaps put a little more simply by Alan Watts. So Alan Watts was a thinker, he was a philosopher, kind of a self-styled sage, in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. He's from England, moves here to the United States, popular radio broadcasts all through the 50s, 60s, and 70s. Look him up. He's actually really well worth studying. So he's an Eastern scholar, and he was one of the first people to help popularize like Eastern belief systems here in the West. And so he puts this stuff in a little more plain English. And so I'm reading from Alan Watts's Become What You Are. So here's what he says about Lao Tzu and the way in the Tao Te Ching. The essence of Lao Tzu's philosophy is the difficult art of getting out of one's own way, of learning how to act without forcing conclusions, of living in skillful harmony with the process of nature instead of trying to push them around. For Lao Tzu's Taoism is the philosophical equivalent of jujitsu or judo, which means the way of gentleness. Its basis is the principle of Tao, which may be translated the way of nature. But in the Chinese language, the word which we render as nature has a special meaning not found in its English equivalent. Translated literally, it means self-so. For to the Chinese, nature is what works and moves by itself without having to be shoved about. So what does any of this have to do with our day-to-day? And let's say kids coming in and out of classrooms, or teachers trying to navigate education, or parents trying to navigate education. So I want to give you 3 tools that'll help put what we just read into practice. And so make it practical, make it very simple. And so then when we take a deeper dive into Buddhism, Taoism, Confucianism, and the Western philosophers, Plato, Aristotle, these 3 components will help you understand them. In particular, these 3 principles are Eastern, in particular. You do see elements of it in the West, but in particular, these are Eastern. And this is just great life-adjusting advice, which I see in a lot of my friends around me. I see it in a lot of students around me. As I go through this, hopefully you can identify with quite a bit of it. So the first thing I want to bring up is a concept called interbeing. Interbeing. And interbeing means simply that it's a concept that you're connected to everything around you. You could take this to the literal conclusion and say that everything is one, right? Or you can just say, well, I'm related to everything around me. The way I like to put this is how I treat my dog in the morning is how I'm going to treat Kenny, my producer, right? How I treat Kenny is how I'm going to treat Calvin, my other producer. How I treat my students in a classroom is going to be how I treat my family, my wife, that all things are connected. And more importantly, how I treat myself is going to be how I treat everyone around me. And so let's say if you're battling addiction or you're doing something that's harming yourself or you're depressed, it affects everything around you. And so part of this is overcoming your ego, that it's not just about you. It's not just about your own being. Watts talks about that. If you want to learn more about that, Alan Watts's work is quite good. That it's not just you separate from the world. You take a look at like ancient Chinese paintings, classic Chinese paintings juxtaposed with Roman and Greek paintings. And so you get to Rome and you see individuals. We'll have a podcast on this in the future with art. So the Romans, you have this famous fresco of two individuals, right, married. And then you look at Chinese paintings and it's always the humans are small and they're in the middle of nature because they're part of nature. They're not the key figure. And that's one of the huge differences between East and West. The West traditionally is more individualistic, which means that you can wind up feeling a little more alone. And so the first component is interbeing, that things are connected. And this is going to be key to understanding the differences between East and West as we move forward, especially when we get up to even the modern world and geopolitics. And these aren't just 2,000-year-old philosophies that are good for day-to-day behavior. They're 2,000-year-old philosophies for understanding how the world works around us that are relevant today. So interbeing, things are connected. The next one is impermanence, and the concept that you never step in the same river twice. And it's an interesting way to look at it. And the argument can be had that the Buddhists were the world's first physicists. I mean, they understood that you put your foot in that river, the water moves. You take your foot out, you put your foot back in, it's different water. Like literally from a molecular level, it's a different water. So the concept of impermanence means that life constantly changes, which might seem like a real obvious thing. You might roll your eyes at it. Okay, I know this. This isn't rocket science. But if you slow down and think about this for a second, impermanence. Let's talk about your cell phone and the picture, the ability to take pictures now all the time, or a camera. We're obsessed with taking pictures. I'm the worst at it. I go on vacation and I could take 2,000 pictures of the same thing. So I was in China and I must have taken 500 photos of the Temple of Heaven. Oh, the Temple of Heaven looks great right here, but what about 1 degree to the side? What about 1 degree to the left? What about 1 degree down below? And all of us, I'm sure if we scroll through our phones right now, you'll have hundreds of photos and we're going to go to our graves with them, and then they're going to be stored on the cloud somewhere. So why this obsession with photos? This is a TED Talk I'd love to give in the future, right about. Yeah, and this is a theme that we're going to trace all through human history. Human beings are obsessed with immortality. We want to live forever. That's a universal human concept. And so in all the major religions, you see concepts of living forever, whether it's energy in the universe, whether it's heaven, kingdom of heaven. And in science, let's say you're driven by science. Right now, major universities are investing in the concept of can we or can we not download your conscious thought? We are obsessed with that. And I think that's why we take so many pictures of everything. We want it to stop. We want to be there forever. We've all had that experience on vacation where you look at whoever you're with and you say, man, I don't want to go home. But you have to. But we don't want life to change. And that brings me to the third component, and probably the most difficult to practice and understand, detachment. Sometimes you'll see this called a not self, a not being. And it doesn't mean that you're a nihilist and there's no meaning to life. It means that you let go of the attachments that drive you. So, for example, like in America, it's always easy to use politics as an example. So let's go there real quick. I might think that I'm in group A and group B is wrong, right? And so I get attached to that. My day-to-day conversations are about that. I post about that. That becomes who I am. I'm attached to it. And it's going to drive my anger. It's going to drive my feelings. Vice versa. Maybe I'm group B and I think A is wrong. And going with politics, we get fatalistic with it, right? If group A is elected, we're going to lose our country. If group B is elected, we're going to lose our country. We get obsessed with that. On a more personal level, and just being a teacher, I see young people get obsessed with grades. right? They're attached to grades. If I don't get this certain GPA, my future is going to be altered. If I don't do, if I don't get a certain score on the ACT, then somehow I'm less than what I think I am. And we get obsessed with that to the point to where the grade becomes more important than a student's ability to learn how to operate in the world and apply and use knowledge. So that's attachment, and it's incredibly unhealthy because then we start judging ourselves, judging others. And so we have words about that, here in the West about, examine your bias and that sort of thing. But I want to give you a different way to look at attachment and detachment from an Eastern point of view, which I think is really healthy. Here's what it is if you want to detach. To detach means to be present. All right, simple sentence there, but okay, what does that mean? So if you think about this for a second, the only thing you'll ever experience is right now. And I pause, and now you're at a different moment in your life. The only thing that you're going to experience is right now. Kenny and I were talking about his job. He works his tail off. He works in corporate America shipping, and he's busy nonstop. The guy works all day. But what's interesting about Kenny is we were just talking about this, and I'm tired of fretting about the future. I don't worry about the past. I take it day to day. And he's learned to live a very peaceful life amidst the chaos because he's learned to take it day to day. So a good way to practice detachment is this. When you worry too much about the future, whether it's politics, you personally, I'm currently torn up on whether or not to apply to a PhD, and I've worked out all these scenarios, and in the meantime, it's a beautiful day outside and I've missed it. So when you worry too much about the future, your anxiety goes up. And when you get older, that's really common with the youth, right? They're really worried about the future. Parents get really worried about their child and the future. I have a friend that teaches at another school. Had a parent email one time, and the kid has an A-, and the parents are upset because the teacher has now, quote, ruined this kid's future and they can no longer go to Notre Dame. That's attachment, and that's fear of the future. And the anxiety that raises for the parents and the kids is not healthy. And when you get to my age, it's kind of about the past, and like, my life didn't turn out the way I wanted it to. And that's the key phrase, the way I wanted it to. I wanted it to be static. I wanted it to be a certain way, just like a photo I took. But life changes. That is the rule. It's impermanent. And so when you get to my age, you start thinking about the past, and that's when you start living with regret. I should have done this. I should have done that. I often wonder sometimes if it's healthy when I tell kids, if I could go live it all over again, this is what I would do. I say that all the time, but when you look at the logic behind that statement, what I'm really saying is my life was wrong. I don't know if that's really that healthy. So if you live too much in the past, you deal with regret. It's a horrible feeling. You can link that with depression. When you think too much about the future and fret about it, you deal with anxiety, right? And these are not healthy things, and these are things that I see in the world around me. And so that would be my homework for you here for this first episode, is to choose one of those three: interbeing, impermanence, or detachment, and try to recognize those during your day. And understand that, you only step in the same river once, and with the good comes the bad. Going back to our quotes today, that you'll hear that in the West, we like to say things like the Buddha thought that all life was suffering. That's actually not what he thought. That's sort of a Western dismal view of Buddhism, is that people published about in the 1800s and then again in the early 1900s. All life is suffering. You've probably heard that phrase. It's not what the Buddha meant. The Buddha meant that you can't live without suffering, because you can't have happiness without suffering. That goes back to our reading today, the yin and the yang. And so if you have suffering in your life, let's take a look at tools on how to deal with them. And those are the three tools that we offered up here today. So in our next episode, so we're going to cut it short today and let you out of class early. And so I'll let you ponder this. And so this is a perfect episode for you to take on a carpool ride into work or back. So in our next episode, we're going to take these concepts into beekeeping and the forest. And so we're going to take a look at how biology plays into all this and your world around you. My dad was a beekeeper. And so looking back on it now in life, I kind of realized that there's sort of a zen in the art of beekeeping, if you will, that he indirectly taught me. And we'll take a look at some of those other things and your relationship to nature. So with that, we will let you out of class early today. And as always, I just want to thank my students that I currently have. I want to thank my producers. I want to thank any teacher that I've ever taught with, any student I had in the past as well. And as always, I want to thank my lovely wife who is supportive. And so come on back and we will take a look at, and we'll revisit that blues club and the old musicians. So we'll take you back to the blues, the trees, the bees, and the way on the next Rogue Teacher. Thank you.